Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great crowd here today, and thank you. Welcome to the home of the Center for National Policy and the Truman National Security Project, and to everyone listening on C-SPAN today and watching. We're glad to have you here. My name is Scott Bates. I'm president here at the Center for National Policy. Today we're going to be focusing on some of the most challenging policy questions facing our nation, and they belong to the realm of cyberspace and cybersecurity. We'll talk about how the United States can increase our economic competitiveness, encourage innovation, and strengthen our national security while hopefully enhancing privacy protections. How can we best achieve all those goals? Better yet, how can we accomplish those goals? Are they mutually exclusive? How can we best prepare our nation as a whole, and our workforce in particular, for the challenges of living and working in the information age? We're here today to take on those questions and provide some answers. We'd like to thank our partner, the Christian Science Monitor. This is the second in our series on cyberspace and cybersecurity. We are delighted to be working with you again and look forward to more such ventures in the future. We would also like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, Northrup Grumman, for making this event possible. We have a great event this morning, and we hope that you can stay for all of it. It'll definitely be worth your while. White House Cybersecurity Coordinator Michael Daniel is here, and he will be followed by a panel of three of the most distinguished experts in the field that I know of. Peter Singer of the New America Foundation, Frank Cilluffo at GW, and Jeff Moss. I think Jeff is here as well. So that's going to be a really exciting panel. Jeff said to me, "Are you going to steer me to the landmines or away from them?" I said, "Right into them." So we're going to have an exciting conversation. And I'd also like to point out, he's not in the room, but Matt Rhodes, who's over here, and you'll see him. He's director of our cyberspace and security program here at CNP and the Truman Project. And this Truman community, we're able to pull on the expertise of people, practitioners, policymakers from here to Silicon Valley. I know that they're watching this streaming right now, and so thank you to the community for making that possible, and for Matt for envisioning all of this work here today. So to kick off our program, I'll turn it over to Jonathan Wells of the Christian Science Monitor, and thank you once again for being here.
Is the wire covering my tie? Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all here today. Scott did a good job on acknowledging a number of folks we want to thank. I'm going to do a quick repeat of that. But again, our thanks to the Center for National Policy. As Scott mentioned, this is our second event that we're doing together, and it's hopefully the first of many more to come. Also, a great thanks to Northrop Grumman, our sponsor, who really makes this event possible and intelligent conversations move forward. Scott mentioned our speakers. We're delighted to have Michael Daniel, Jeff Moss, Peter Singer, and Frank Cilluffo. They're going to be part of a panel discussion that I think is going to be quite remarkable and informative. A little bit of promotion. The Monitor has a big announcement today. We are pleased to announce the debut of a new CSM initiative called Passcode. That we call it the Modern Field Guide to Security and Privacy. It relies on a global network of Monitor reporters from around the world, led by Mike Farrell, our editor, and our deputy editor, Sarah Sorsher. Both of them are here today, and they'd be happy to talk to you more about the Monitor's new initiative. We intend to provide deeply reported, solution-oriented, non-fear-mongering coverage that moves your understanding and the discussion forward. Again, you can find us at csmpasscode.com. Now, this is the debut, so stay tuned between now and January when we do our formal launch. So we're here today to talk about cybersecurity. an important topic, one that the monitor is obviously investing resources in. And why is that? Well, primarily, it's a big story. It's a big, complex story that touches a lot of lives. More people than ever impacted and concerned about both privacy and digital security. Much of the discussion, oftentimes, to a degree, focuses on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so what are the monitor values that we're trying to bring to this coverage and discussion? Well, 107 years of journalism that is deeply reported and global. And we'll admit to our biases. We're constructive, progress-minded, and solution-oriented. These days, all media companies have to decide where to invest and what to cover most particularly. And one of the areas we're investing in is cybersecurity. Passcode is how we're doing it. And so remember, csmpasscode.com. It's now my pleasure to introduce Vern Boyle. And one of his colleagues just gave me a quick little headline on Vern, describing him as the rare breed that is a deep technologist that can speak English. I immediately tried to hire him. Vern is director of technology for Northrup Grumman's cyber division, and his team leads an advanced cyber technology team responsible for understanding emerging problems and solving those problems in advance for customers worldwide. Vern will introduce a vision for a new paradigm for cybersecurity thinking with the goal of making our systems more resilient. After Vern finishes, we'll take some Q&A. And with that, Vern, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for having me. So I'm here today to start a new conversation, a conversation about looking at cybersecurity a little bit differently with the goal of making our systems more resilient. My hope is that this conversation can move us past the age of the high-profile breach. Many of the breaches are very well known. They're very personal, like the Home Depot breach, the Target breach. This week, the J.P. Morgan Chase breach was in the news front and center. These are very personal to us because they're criminal in nature, and the idea of money coming out of our wallets is a scary thing. But there are also other high-profile breaches that in some ways are even more disturbing, but that aren't always as well known. So you have the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco some time ago. This was an attack on a national critical infrastructure provider. And you have the issue with the French and British Navy back in 2009 with the Conficker virus. And these attacks were aimed at disabling those organizations' ability to conduct their primary mission. And you can imagine the military unable to perform its mission as a result of a computer virus. This is a very real potential problem. And then you have the insider threat. We're all familiar with the Snowden case. And you have the cyber vigilantes like Anonymous, conducting espionage, disrupting systems for a wide variety of purposes. So this is a global, borderless problem, and it's not going away anytime soon. So the real question is, why is it so easy for the attacker and seemingly so hard for the defender? How is it that they seem to march in and out of these systems as if nobody's watching? And you'll get a lot of different opinions on that. People spend their careers trying to figure that out. But when you blow away all the smoke, I think it comes down really to two root problems. The first is that the cyber systems that we rely on are inherently vulnerable. So the commercial operating systems, the commercial software packages, the commercial hardware platforms, these are all designed primarily to address profit motives. They're easily obtained by the attacker. They can exploit and find the vulnerabilities in those systems, and that's largely what they take advantage of. That's probably not going to change anytime soon. And then the second problem is that you have machines against people in a high-speed battle. And now what do I mean by that? Well, you have hundreds of thousands of malware samples being generated every month. So that's not people writing that malware. Those are machines. And those are machines automatically circumventing all of our defensive systems. That malware typically operates inside of an infrastructure that is also automatically controlled by machines. So the command and control nodes, the hop points, the channels that connect these different adversary systems together are typically set up, used one time or for a very limited period of time, and then they're torn down and they're never seen again. Now let's contrast that with the way we defend our systems. So we have fixed infrastructures, monitored by thousands of people, climbing up mountains of data, trying to sort through what's happening, patching software, writing signatures, reacting and chasing, and trying to find this machine-driven, fast-moving target. So you have a static, human-controlled system battling with an automated, machine-driven system. And at the end of the day, the machines are going to win that battle every time. It doesn't matter how many people you try to put up against those machines. And so how do we fix that? How do we overcome that? How do we develop a protective strategy that makes the systems inherently resilient? One way that I'd like to introduce into this conversation is by making our cyber systems disposable. And I don't mean disposable in the sense that you throw them away like a paper cup. I'm talking about disposable in the sense that they are single use. Because if you think about it, that is exactly what the adversary is doing. Their malware, their command and control, their channels, single use. And we can do the very same thing with our own cyber systems. This would make it far more difficult for an adversary to gain access and persist into the system if what they saw on Tuesday was no longer there on Wednesday and it was different yet again on Thursday. So this would shift the battle from us chasing them to them chasing us. And that would move the advantage in favor of the defender. There are 6 technologies that make this concept possible. You're going to recognize them because they're already out there, and they're in varying degrees of maturity. So 3 of them are sort of the biggies, and then there's three smaller enablers underneath that. So the first is the cloud computing paradigm. So this is a technology that is designed to be flexible, reconfigurable. You can establish compute and storage devices anywhere, anytime. It's essentially a disposable technology. The second big pillar is software-defined networking. Think of this as cloud for communications. So again, rather than a static communication channel, software-defined networking allows you to do ad hoc networking, allows unconventional devices to behave as routers, and really provides a lot more of that sort of flexible, reconfigurable, disposable capability. And the third big pillar are these increasingly mobile endpoints. And while many people think that the mobile endpoints are more vulnerable, when you look at the security architecture, it's actually moving in the direction of being more secure. And again, it enables a very flexible, reconfigurable, disposable approach. When you bring those 3 pieces together, the software-defined networking, the cloud, and the increasingly mobile endpoint, you have the opportunity to create an entirely disposable system. So rather than fixed static gateways, static routes, static endpoints that never move, we would have virtualized moving gateways, ad hoc networks, and single-use private endpoints. This system would be controlled by our network defenders. So rather than spending their time reacting and chasing and climbing up that mountain of data, they would spend their time proactively reconfiguring these systems so that they are very hard to understand and breach. Underneath of those 3 big building blocks, there are 3 other critical enablers. They are root of trust, identity, and always-on encryption. Part of the disposable concept of operations is to configure, operate, dispose, and restore. That restoration piece comes from the root of trust. Identity is a very important thing within this paradigm. Being able to understand the identity of the machines and the people and permitting them into the system, permitting them the access to information based on their identity and their role is a key to keeping unauthorized people out of the system. And the always-on encryption is a no-brainer. Right? You don't open the door and let somebody come in and walk all over your network. Right? You need to lock down zones and lock down different information based on always-on encryption. So when those 6 technologies are brought together, again, it creates the opportunity for us to enable a disposable system concept of operations. Let me talk about a couple of scenarios of how that might be used to kind of illustrate the application of this system. So the first one I'd like to talk about is an operations center scenario, more of a strategic network. So imagine operators coming in to perform their job, and rather than carrying their device with them or finding the device on their desk, they walk into the building and they pull it off of a rack or out of a bin. That device would have been established to a known good state by a team of people, network defenders that know how to do that from the root of trust. When he turns the machine on, it has an identity, it turns on the encrypted channel. That machine authenticates itself into a central system. The operator then uses his fingerprint, his voice print, his CAC card to authenticate himself into the system, and his personal configuration is loaded onto this device. When he walks into the operations floor, his other analyst friends are there with him, and they form up a private ad hoc network among the team, fully encrypted. Only the people permitted to participate in that mission are allowed inside. Those people can be outside the building. They can be around the world. They can be anywhere. So those operators can function throughout the day within this private, trusted environment. And at the end of their shift, they turn the machine off, they toss it back in the bin, and they leave. That machine is then wiped clean. It's given a new identity. And the next shift of operators can come in and do the same thing. So that system is essentially disposed of. It's never used again. The routes, the nodes, the identities, if somebody were able to see and understand it when they came in the next day, it wouldn't be there anymore. Now let's take that into a more tactical environment, because tablets and laptops are not the only kind of endpoints that we need to be concerned about. We need to think about unmanned vehicles, UAVs. We need to think about sensors on UAVs. We need to think about fire control systems. All of these can function within the same disposable concept of operations. So imagine, if you will, a special forces team has been asked to go perform a rescue mission. They need to have overhead surveillance to help them out, and we're going to use some UAVs for that support. So once again, the UAVs should not be sitting there with untrusted software on them, with untrusted operating systems. They should be loaded for that specific mission at the time of the mission from a strong root of trust. The people flying the UAVs and controlling them should have their identity authenticated into that system so that they can move the UAVs over to the area of interest. And then the ground forces will have some device that is also built from a strong root of trust so that they can receive the real-time video they need to conduct their mission. And in the end, all of those systems will come back, they'll get wiped clean, they'll be given new identities, and once again, that system is essentially disposed of, never used again. So this is a concept that would be very frustrating to an adversary. Imagine them spending their time mapping, trying to find holes. Maybe they actually identified some, but the next time they come back to take advantage of that, that system's no longer there. So how do we get there? How do we move from the react and chase model to this proactive, disposable concept of operations? Well, one thing you don't do is take the current security architecture and implement it onto this flexible, reconfigurable infrastructure. So for example, you wouldn't want to take today's monitoring applications, virtualize them, and put them into the cloud, because all you're really doing is implementing the same paradigm, and you're going to still be reacting and chasing. What we need to do is take those 6 key building blocks. We need to bring them together. We need to accelerate the integration of those 6 technologies, and then we need to build that proactive model for security. this will make it far more difficult for the adversary to gain access and persist. If there is an insider threat, it will make it far more difficult for him to reach out and grab information he's not permitted to have. So if we want our systems to be more resilient in the future, we need to think about making them disposable. Thank you. And I guess we'll take some questions now.
Right. Thank you very much. So I've been given the opportunity to ask the lead-off question, and I'm going to seize that opportunity. So first of all, Vern, I love this, this image that you present of moving the momentum from the attacker to the defender. And it's very helpful to look at the three core and three supporting technologies that could create a disposable system. Within those three, is there an area that your team is thinking most about, and or a next step in this integration that would move us forward in creating these disposable systems, i.e., where should we focus next?
Well, we're researching each of those technologies, and some of the customers are also researching each of those technologies. I think where we need to go next is in the direction of bringing those 6 pieces together and really figuring out how to implement that disposable command and control, that disposable security model to wrap around the 6 key technologies. But we're already working on the individual pieces.
Excellent. Great. Let's ask some questions from the floor. And I think, is there a mic that gentleman here on my right?
Hi, thank you so much. This is very informative and interesting. My name is Guy Taylor. I'm the National Security Team Leader at the Washington Times. And I have a question about, you were touted as someone who speaks English or common man language about this. So what, let's say this hypothetical UAV mission that you're talking about involves recording some video. Where would that video then be stored once these systems are wiped? And would that system on which that video is stored be something that gets recycled constantly? It sounds like an inconceivable amount of data that would have to be wiped and moved all the time.
Yes, good question. So we're actually not talking about disposing of mission data. You know, the recorded video would potentially be temporarily stored on board or moved into a back-end cloud infrastructure. And what we're talking about wiping and restoring are the infrastructure pieces of the system. So the processors and the operating systems and the software that collects the video is what would be wiped clean and restored. The mission data would be preserved and put into the cloud and moved and changed as part of this kind of moving target disposable model.
Thank you. In the back, and could you state your name and affiliation, please, when you take the mic?
Hi. Hi, Brian Pendleton, private security consultant. My question is, what about cost and risk analysis? You talked about having multiple sets of laptops, infrastructure. Businesses have a huge cost there, so how are you going to get them to buy into this?
Right. So that's a good question. And I've been asked that before. What is the cost of something like this? And I think you want to look at this from a life cycle cost perspective of a breach. What does it cost when an organization, whether it be a military organization or a financial organization, experiences a breach? What does that cost? The second dimension of cost is the man hours. How much time, how much money are we spending chasing, reacting, searching for things that are no longer there? We want to shift that to a more efficient use of those man hours. So those are really the 2 biggest variables in the cost equation: cost of the breach and the cost of the people. And I think if you move the needle on those, you're going to wind up coming out ahead.
We have time for one last question. That was fast. Yes, gentleman in the black shirt here.
Yes, Hamed Behravan with Voice of America. In terms of the rapid response that you mentioned, that is going to shift and you're going to have disposable responses, is that country specific? For example, we know Iran, China, and Russia use different tactics. Do you also analyze what kind of methods they use so the response that you give would be specific to those countries?
I think one of the advantages of a proactive security model is that it's somewhat agnostic to the attacker. Right. So our goal is not to try to analyze, react, and chase what the adversary is doing. Our goal is to take control of our own systems and proactively configure them so that they're very hard to gain access to. So independent of who's attempting to gain access, whether it's a criminal, a cyber vigilante, a nation state, we want to take control of our systems. That's what the proactive security model is all about.
Vern, thank you so much. I mean, it's fascinating to hear of a potential more agile response to defending cyber attacks, and we appreciate your thoughts immensely today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick round of applause. We're now going to move to the next phase of today's discussion, and I want to introduce Mike Farrell, who will be up in just a moment. Mike is the editor of the Monitor's new passcode section. He's a veteran tech and business correspondent who shared in the Boston Globe's recent Pulitzer Prize. We're delighted to bring Mike from the Globe back to the Monitor, where he was reporting from our San Francisco bureau and was at one time our Mideast editor. We're thrilled to have him leading our passcode team, and Mike's going to introduce you to our next speaker.
So are we all mic'd up? Everyone can hear us? Okay, great. I'm Mike Farrell. I'm an editor at the Christian Science Monitor, and I'm pleased to introduce Michael Daniel, who probably in this crowd needs little introduction, but he is a special advisor to President Obama and the cybersecurity coordinator, which I think he himself has described as sort of a job of herding cats, because he oversees many different agencies who have many different protocols when it comes to their security implementation and issues. And so I'll turn it over to Michael. He's got some words to say, and then we'll do a brief Q&A and then turn it over to the audience.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this morning and participating in this event. It's, I would be remiss if I didn't remark that it is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and so appreciate all of the interest in this particular topic. I think one of the points that I would like to make just to start, I think that cybersecurity, you can clearly see it emerging as one of the defining policy challenges we face for the 21st century. And I think that is actually driven by several factors, but one of them is actually at its root is it's not obvious why cybersecurity is, in fact, such a really hard problem for us. If you look at the data on intrusions, it actually is pretty clear that most of the time the bad guys are getting in through holes that we know about and holes that we know how to fix. So at one level, cybersecurity really shouldn't actually be a hard problem. But if you take a step back and you think about the various aspects that cyber has taken on, and given the depth of penetration it has had into all of our social lives, our private lives, our public lives in terms of the interaction with the government, and in the private sector, our commerce and economics, you start to realize that cybersecurity is not primarily a technical problem. It is also an economics problem in terms of incentives. It's a human behavioral and psychological problem. It's a physics problem because of the way networks are constructed. It's a political problem because of its international dimensions. And when you start to roll all of that together, suddenly you have what the folks from Boston might call a wicked problem.
Very good.
And that's what I think starts to actually make cyber security the particularly difficult challenge that it is for us. And that's why I think it takes such a wide variety of disciplines to begin to address the problem. From the administration side, one of the things I wanted to highlight for this audience today is our efforts to actually expand the cybersecurity workforce. And so to address that problem, you really want a much larger and much broader workforce than we currently have. We need a much bigger workforce to deploy against the problem. And it needs to have an incredibly wide array of skills, ranging from a lot more technically focused folks to help companies out with, and government agencies out with their immediate technical problems associated with cybersecurity, but also people that understand how cybersecurity interacts with their industries, how it interacts with industrial control systems, how it interacts with our financial sector. So from a policy standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from an international standpoint. And so from the administration standpoint, we are really trying to drive a connection with the administration's jobs-driven training initiative. And in fact, earlier this month, we rolled out a whole slew of grants for community colleges and other universities, a lot of which will go to cybersecurity-related programs to support efforts in expanding that. And of course, because this is Washington, we have an acronym for our efforts in this area, the National Initiative for Cyber Education, the NICE. It's a nice acronym. But that's really focused on sort of three different efforts, one of which is to expand a heat map of, develop a heat map of where the cybersecurity-related jobs are, to really expand the number of cyber centers of academic excellence that are accredited by DHS and the National Security Agency, and to expand the Scholarship for Service program that funds specific cybersecurity-related scholarships. So in all of that effort, we are really trying to just do what we can from a policy perspective to drive an expansion in our cyber workforce so that we have the personnel that we'll need to address this wicked problem that I've talked about. I'm sure there are a lot of other topics that folks want to get into, some of which are more strategic, some of which are topical, and we can go ahead and do that.
You bring up some great points about how to confront this wicked problem. But, you also say that it's really, in many ways, not that difficult a problem. In hindsight, when we look at a lot of the breaches that occur, some of them are occurring because of vulnerabilities we already know about. So it's not just an issue of throwing bodies at it, right? It's also a mindset shift. So
that's correct.
So how do you, confront that issue? Is it training? Is it sort of redirecting the existing workforce to do their job that they should be doing in a better way? Or is it a technical fix? How do you see that?
I see it as a combination of all of those factors. Some of it is baking the security in up front so that developers, as they think about developing software and apps and other things, that security is just one of the aspects, along with usability, along with the interface that you consider when you do development. So that's one aspect of it. Another is really I think some of the ideas that are embedded in the cybersecurity framework of standards and best practices. So it's, as a business, as an organization, how do you think about cybersecurity risk? And sort of really starting to embed thoughts about risk management and cyber risk management the same way that companies manage their litigation risk or their product risk. And that it's something that you invest in to manage the risk. And other pieces of it are really us understanding how to enable technologies and capabilities that are focused on how people actually have to interact with their information technology. So one example is killing off the password. Frankly, I would really love to kill the password dead as a primary security method because it's terrible. But it has to be. But when we think about replacing it, it has to be replaced with something that's actually easy for people to use.
Right. So what would replace the password?
So I think that there's going to be a variety of technologies that will be able to do that. Some of which will be biometric related. You've started to see some of that with the emergence of the fingerprint readers, but also you can use the cameras on cell phones, which are now ubiquitous, so that the selfies are actually used for something besides posting on Facebook. There are also all sorts of different related technologies that can make use of multi-factor authentication that's still easy to use because of the way that people use their devices, card readers. All of those factors will be combined, and I think there won't be one solution for everything. There'll be multiple different solutions. The other thing is we'll do solutions at different levels because there'll be things that we really care about securing, like your bank transactions, and things that you're a little bit less worried about, like the cat videos on YouTube.
Those are important.
So
this being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, the Monitor did a poll recently to see exactly what people are doing to improve their security, especially after the string of high-profile breaches we've seen in the news. We found that basically half the people did something to improve their networks, and half the other people did nothing. Of the people who did nothing, they said, well, they're not really concerned about it. Is that a realistic view of the current landscape, given what we're confronting?
So, I think that cybersecurity, you're not going to be surprised that the cybersecurity coordinator says that cybersecurity is an issue that affects everyone. Right. I'd probably not be doing my job well if I said otherwise. But I do think that it's an issue that everyone should be concerned about at some level because almost everyone lives some aspect of their lives online, either in the form of how you interact with a company, the data that a company might have on you. Even people that are largely not connected are still, their data is online in various places. So it's something that everyone should really have some concerns about. But I do think that what that shows, though, is that we still need to work on, again, I come back to making it available and easy for people to use and to do, and to make it sort of security by default rather than something you actually have to work really hard at.
So what would that mean, security by default, in terms of the apps people use and the websites they visit?
Sure. So I think that a lot of this comes back to how do we do the development work to make sure that we're developing secure code from the beginning. How do you have systems that are much more intelligent themselves about monitoring their own activity, and you bring in the disciplines of things like biology, and how do you have networks that are sort of have the equivalence of the T and B cells that live in your body that hunt down intruders, so that it's sort of just present on the network, and all of that happens much more in the background, rather than being something that people have to actively engage in. And it also, I think, is making those services available to both businesses and consumers so that they can set them up and have them be functional on their networks.
Should the government be pushing the private sector harder? The NIST framework is nice. It's a framework. It's voluntary. Should it be mandatory, or should there be aspects of it that should be mandatory?
So from our perspective, we firmly believe that it can remain a voluntary standard, a voluntary framework, and still be effective. We actually have a long history of voluntary standards being quite effective in the United States. I think that ultimately it's the market forces that will really make that take off and go someplace, and that's the most effective tool that we can harness in that area.
The whole focus of this talk is developing America's edge in cybersecurity.
Right.
I think clearly we can anybody who looks at the news can see, well, we don't have the edge. I think probably everyone read the Times story yesterday about the White House being concerned about J.P. Morgan. That shouldn't be a surprise. But the Times article really didn't say what the White House was talking about, so we're glad you're here to fill us in on that a little bit more. Go ahead.
So I think that, in general, we have watched for several years, the trend of the malicious actors in cyberspace trying to figure out how to target our critical infrastructure. And the financial sector is, as we all painfully learned in the mid-2000s, is a critical part of our economy and definitely a critical infrastructure for us. So obviously, anytime we see one of our major banks being targeted and successfully targeted, that is going to be a source of concern for the White House. I would put it in its more general context, though, that it is really the broad trend of the targeting of U.S. critical infrastructure and how is it that we can do a better job of protecting that critical infrastructure over the long term that is particularly concerning to us. Well, obviously, we are concerned about any incident that exposes that many people, as that incident seems to have done. It's also the broader, longer-term trends that we are very concerned about.
Specifically, which trends? Can you point to a few things that you're most concerned about?
Sure. So if you look at sort of three broad trends that you can pick out. One, we are hooking more and more stuff up to the internet all the time. The so-called Internet of Things that has already somewhat arrived. Your thermostat, your coffee maker, your car, your refrigerator, they're all now threat vectors in cyber terms. So that's made. We thought that doing cybersecurity in a world of wired desktops was hard. Now we're going to do it now we're going to do it with the big data mobile cloud, right? So just throw in all the buzzwords at the same time. But that makes the problem just that much harder.
Right.
We've also watched the malicious actors be willing to move up the threat spectrum. So now it's not just a matter of doing the digital equivalent of graffiti, but they are actually willing to take destructive steps. We saw that with the Saudi Arab American Oil Company in 2012. We've seen that with the South Korean banks in 2013. We've seen that in the denial of service attacks on our own financial institutions here. And we also know that the tactics and the capabilities that are available to the malicious actors are also growing. They frequently don't have to use them yet, but we know and we can watch their sophistication growing. And if you actually just look at, there's kind of this myth now that a lot of these hackers are still, like the disgruntled teen in their mother's basement, which, there are still some of those, but, hacking is a big business, and they are run like businesses. And many of these organizations actually operate along very structured corporate lines. And so the sophistication that's available and the resources that are available to them, are far, far more extensive than they were, say, 10 years ago.
So that's pretty interesting, right? Because the hackers are basically many steps ahead of what we're doing now to try to protect our networks. Given that that's the case, should there, when you think about this world of critical infrastructures, which I guess there are 16 sectors, right? Some are sort of critical, some are really critical. When you think about the electrical grid or the nuclear power plants,
right?
Should some of those even be connected to outside networks? Could you just pull the plug essentially, and is that the best way of protecting a nuclear power plant, for instance?
So as tempting as that might be to do as a solution, I also don't think it's possible for us to wind the clock back and not have some of these systems enabled for access. Now, I think you need to think about that, and there may be some systems that we actually decide that we may want to set them up so that if you may be able to get data from them remotely, but if you actually want to make changes to them, you have to be physically present. You could set up the systems to do that, but one of the rules that we have around our office is that expediency will trump cybersecurity every time. So that unless you specifically put in policies to prevent that, most people will take the expedient route. Mm-hmm. And you find that a lot of times when these systems end up being connected to the internet is because, well, that was easier for the engineers or whatever to do their job. And that's true, but there is a security downside to that. And organizations need to think about that convenience versus security trade-off and actually do that as a more explicit risk calculation. And in some cases, it may well be the case that the asset is so particularly critical that you don't want it directly connected up. In other cases, that may be a risk that you're willing to live with putting into place other compensating controls. But I think that's something that needs to be given a lot more explicit thought rather than sort of letting it just kind of happen.
Right. Are there particular areas that you think that we should sort of limit that access?
Well, it's a little hard for me to say from not sort of being deeply involved in sort of all the technical aspects of all the different industries, right? But clearly, what I would argue is that that's where that combination of the subject matter experts and the security folks in any given organization need to have some real conversations about what the risk is and what the benefits are, and really explicitly make that trade-off.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that's come up recently, I think, in debates in Washington in the industry is this notion of having a professionalized cybersecurity workforce, right? So in addition to just having more trained people in the field or just more people, the notion of having somebody who's actually certified some way, being a cybersecurity specialist. What's your view on that?
I definitely think that cybersecurity will evolve as a discipline, and it is, I think, becoming its own discipline, and it's not the same as some of the other technical computer science fields, and involves, I think, bringing in capacities from other areas, and so I think it will evolve into its own discipline, and I think having some of those certifications would be a good thing.
So you yourself have had to learn a lot about this field, right? You're not a techie.
I'm not.
You're not an engineer. You took some grief for that in the press. What did you think about that?
Well, actually, I was, it happened during August on a Friday, so that was kind of par for the course in Washington, and it kind of just comes with the territory, I think, here. I think some of it, though, was a misunderstanding of what I was trying to say, which is that and that was my point about why I think cybersecurity is such a hard problem, is that in fact actually it involves a whole bunch of different disciplines, and we need a bunch of different disciplines in order to actually address the problem effectively. And so we certainly need, and as I was mentioning about our workforce initiatives, a huge chunk of that is focused on the hardcore technical workforce that we really need to run the firewalls and develop the software and manage the security systems. But you also need people that are savvy about cybersecurity from a policy standpoint and about how to actually get organizations to make those risk management trade-offs. How do you actually get organizations to make changes? How do you get the government to actually do something? And how do you get the bureaucracy to actually function? Those are all different. Those are actually different skill sets, and we need all of them in the cybersecurity area. And so if you look at, for example, the Cybersecurity Directorate on the National Security Council staff, I have an incredibly wide array of people who are engineers with technical skills, but also people who are primarily have legal backgrounds, people who have done development work in the international space, people who have spent time in the military, people who have spent time in law enforcement, because all of those are different aspects of the problem that we need to bring to bear on the issue.
And I imagine your experience in government, various agencies, helps you with the herding cats issue that you have to confront.
Yes.
I mean, do you think, so in your role as a coordinator, you don't have any, real power over these organizations, right? You can make suggestions, but you can't say you have to do this. Do you think that role has to change in the future?
Actually, I don't. I think that I believe that as with any of the White House jobs, a lot of it is about the soft power and the way that you work within the bureaucracy and the different agencies to get them to align policy and move roughly in the same direction. And I think that you can be very effective in that space as long as you understand how that space actually operates. I think that cyber is such a humongous issue that you're not going to be able to put any one person in charge of it in that sense. And I actually think that would be, that would not work very well. And instead, you actually do need somebody who can get the various aspects of the law enforcement agencies, what we're doing to protect our critical infrastructure, what we're doing in the military and national security space. And you're never going to put all of that in one spot under one person. And I don't think that would be a good idea. So you really need to have those skills to manage across all those different agency lines.
Can you give us a bit of an update on what you're doing in Congress to get the cybersecurity legislation moving?
Sure. So I think we've been heavily involved with working with the committees on the relevant committees of jurisdiction in both the House and the Senate to work on the legislation and make improvements to it and get it into a place that could pass both houses and that the president could sign. We remain committed to doing that, but obviously getting anything passed on Capitol Hill right now is quite a challenge. So I think that we try to be realistic, but it's something that we still remain heavily engaged with.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about smartphones before coming on stage, and another thing in the news is that Apple and both Google are strengthening their security protections on their phones, something that FBI director and the Attorney General don't really like so much. What's your view of that?
Well, I think if the issue is not so much strengthening the encryption itself. Obviously, I mean, if you look at the NIST framework, right, encryption is a best practice in cybersecurity, and encrypting data at rest and data in motion are obviously smart things to do. So it's not so much the encryption itself, it's how is it that the government and our law enforcement agencies can continue to gain access to information in the course of an investigation in a court-approved process in a way that doesn't put something completely beyond the reach of law enforcement. Even things that are in safes or other places are reachable by search warrant in many cases, and so we don't want to have something that puts it utterly beyond the reach of law enforcement in appropriate circumstances. On the other hand, I think clearly we need to improve the use of encryption and how we employ it. And in many cases, that's something that would be very beneficial, for example, to protecting our intellectual property. This is a really hard area, and I think the reason that you see we've had debates about encryption going back decades, and probably for as long as there's been encryption, that probably the Babylonians and the Greeks had arguments about the use of it in some form. So I think that this is going to continue to be a policy tension that we're going to have to try to navigate.
Right. You'll have to talk to Jeff Moss about getting some better hackers working together. Well, anyways, I think we have some time for questions from the audience. If anyone's got anything, you there.
Hi, Michael. Dave Prayer from Politico. Can you elaborate a little bit more on White House observation of what was going on at J.P. Morgan and the other financial institutions? In what context? Was it standalone briefings? Was it briefings in the context of just to randomly suggest something, Russia sanctions?
So I think the way to think about this is that we keep part of our job on the National Security Council is to make sure that the president and his senior advisors remain informed about the wide array of national security threats that confront the country. And so that was the context in which we were treating this particular issue. It is part of an ongoing law enforcement investigation with the FBI and Secret Service. So there's obviously a limit to how much I can comment on an ongoing investigation in that area. So I think that it's something that, again, we pay attention to in the sense of that we are mindful of all the threats to our critical infrastructure, whether you're talking about the financial sector, the electric sector, the telecommunications sector, And so it's put into that broader context. And anytime we see specific targeting or successful penetrations of those kinds of companies, it's something we're going to engage on.
Are you in the back?
Sorry to hog the microphone, but I don't think anybody else had their hands up. Thank you so much. I want to ask, and maybe it's a difficult question. I don't want to feel like I'm conflating things, but broadly, one of the topics that you two have bounced back and forth on here is the extent to which the executive and the legislature should be potentially pressuring private companies to adhere to certain cybersecurity standards. And on one hand, I think you said that, in fact, the administration's position is that the government should not be pushing the private sector harder because market forces can be trusted to take care of such. But then, on the other hand, you said expediency will trump cybersecurity every time. So in a week in which the JP attack might have been averted if certain standards were in place, which is it?
So I would say that there's a difference between making something like the NIST cybersecurity framework mandatory and saying that the government doesn't have any role in cajoling and pressuring the private sector to continue focusing on and doing a better job in cybersecurity. And I'm always concerned about a regulatory framework that is, the speed of regulation does not move at the speed of technology. And so want to be very mindful of that fact. And that's why we have tried to make, for example, the framework technology agnostic, technology neutral, for that very precise reason. That is different than saying that the government doesn't want to be involved with and work with the private sector to improve cybersecurity across the board. In fact, I firmly believe that one of the key challenges we face is actually figuring out how the federal government should interact with the private sector with respect to cybersecurity. And it won't be a traditional regulatory framework. It also won't be a traditional contractual framework that we've used, where we're just buying goods and services from the private sector. It's going to be some sort of new kind of partnership, and that, in fact, is what kind of one of the defining policy challenges that we'll be working on over the next, I would argue, 5 to 10 years really is. How is it that the government at all levels is going to interact with the private sector on this issue that cuts across so many different boundaries and jurisdictions, both within the United States and then internationally as well?
Talking about hiring cybersecurity staff. When I've spoken to people in the industry for years, they've said that some of their main problems with working for the federal government have been salary, job structure, and just also the issue of getting a job with the federal government can be a bit of a pain. We haven't seen much movement.
That's an understatement, yes.
Those are three areas that really we haven't seen much movement on, and I'm wondering if there's any push, if there's any progress.
So we are pushing on along various avenues, trying to address some of those problems that you're talking about, including trying to get broader hiring authorities in cybersecurity for cybersecurity professionals, to make it easier to move among agencies once you're in the federal government, to address some of those key problems. I think that it's unrealistic for the federal government to expect that it will compete with the private sector on salary directly. And so I think that we can do a better job in that space, but we're never going to completely overcome that. So we have to address it more in the form of the kinds of work that you get to do in the federal government that you are not able to do in the private sector, and focus on those aspects of the job. It's certainly a complicated area, and it's one that we are trying to dedicate some resources to addressing. But I think that overall we still have to grow the workforce as a whole, because we're still poaching from everybody's poaching from everybody else for the limited talent pool that's out there.
What's happening in that regard in terms of recruitment? Are you going to college campuses to try to, are you showing up at MIT and Carnegie Mellon to get the smartest kids to come work for the government? And how has the NSA revelations, the Snowden leaks, hurt that effort too? Because certainly there's a PR problem with that plays out there.
Well, certainly we're trying to do recruitment and expand our efforts in there. Clearly, the fiscal challenges that the federal government has faced overall have not made that any easier to do. I would say that we continue to try to focus on recruiting the best talent that we can, and there's certainly NSA has faced some challenges with the revelations, as you said. But what's interesting to me is that the cyber skills are really needed across a wide variety of places in the federal government, including our law enforcement agencies, which more and more crime has moved online, so they have a greater need for that. DHS has a huge need for cybersecurity experts in protecting critical infrastructure. Places like NIST that actually develop the framework, they have a need for cybersecurity workforce. So I think that it's also something that we're having to address holistically across the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Josh Higgins from Inside Cybersecurity. I was wondering, with the NIST framework workshop coming up, what is the administration hoping to see come out of that and moving forward with the framework?
So I think a large part of what we're hoping for with that workshop is really starting to get some feedback from organizations about how they've actually been employing the framework and what's been their experience with using it. What has been the strengths, what's been the weaknesses of it, where does it need some refinement, some clarification, expansion. We know that one of the areas that was less well developed in the original work that we did is in metrics, for example, of how you measure employment and the effect of the framework on your organization. And we still need more development in that area. So those are the kinds of things that we're hoping that we'll get out of that workshop, is really sort of a lot of the experiences with how that framework's actually been employed.
Hi, Amber Corrin, Federal Times. Just to follow up on that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of adoption of the framework, how you're measuring that, especially when it comes to the government agencies that are involved. Thanks.
So there are a couple of different aspects to your question. Certainly, from our perspective, we have gotten a lot of feedback from a whole bunch of different sources, including the sector coordinating councils that DHS works with, our different agencies that have connections with different industries, Treasury with the financial services industry, Energy Department with the energy providers. And in our own connections with the tech sector and other things. And in general, the feedback we've gotten has been very positive for the framework. And even companies that oftentimes they will tell us, yeah, we're not going to completely come out publicly and completely embrace the framework, but we're using it, internally. And we're using it even if we aren't officially using it, we're using it to benchmark our progress against and measure ourselves against. So I think that in general we're seeing more and more different uses for the framework. You're seeing different sectors come up with their own sort of overlays for the framework. In my own mind, I actually view the framework's success as one measure of it will be when people start using it for things that we never even anticipated in the first place. That'll actually be a really good sign of adoption. Internationally, we have gotten a lot of good feedback from other governments that they are looking at how to use the framework in their own domestic contexts, which we think is really important. And you also raised the federal government itself. And the recent guidance that came out from the Office of Management and Budget on FISMA, on the Federal Information Security Management Act implementation, is tying it ever closer to the framework. And so I think agency CIOs are getting tired of me coming and talking to them about how they have to use the framework inside their own agencies. But that is clearly the direction that we're moving in, and that we're bringing those principles into how we manage the federal government's own cybersecurity, and we're developing, in fact, an overlay for the federal government that's related to the framework.
So if say, for instance, J.P. Morgan had you been following the framework, could have the breach that had happened been prevented, or others like it?
Maybe, maybe not. But because the framework isn't a particular cookbook for a particular set of security controls, so without having more of the detailed knowledge, it's difficult for me to say. What I can say is what the framework enables you to do is really start to think about how you manage your cybersecurity from a risk perspective. And so what it enables an organization to do is really have a way of confronting what is sometimes otherwise seen as an intractable problem.
I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman there in the black blazer.
Hi. Aaron Alpha from the University of Washington.
You flew all the way in from Washington for this. By the way.
Courtesy of the Tech Policy Lab, so I think rang Kalo for that. So my question is, we talk about the J.P. Morgan breach, the Target breach, and so on and so forth, and these are just reputational hits that keep on flowing in the media. But the operational reality for cybersecurity is you assume you've been breached and you do something about that. And there's a dissonance between that I feel like may not better inform the general public. What are your views on how to kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I think that when you look at, so take it back to the framework, when you actually look at the framework, the very first thing the framework actually talks about, it has nothing to do, it seems, with security at all, which is identify, right? But what it's really saying is you got to actually figure out what information you have that you care about, and why do you care about it? What do you actually want to protect it from? Is it exposure at all, or is it that you want to protect it from manipulation? That's your greatest concern, and so that starts to define how you think about it and how you protect it, which is that second step. But also, the framework then goes on to say you've got to be able to detect when the bad guys are almost inevitably have gotten past your defenses. And then what are you doing to recover and respond to them quickly and then recover from that? And so I think that the part of the way that you have to start to address that is that as an organization, you need to be clear about your holistic approach to handling breaches. From all the way from the beginning, this is how we've identified the information that we care about. Here's why we care about it. Here's what we're trying to protect it from. And if something happens, here's how we're going to respond to it. Here's our metrics and measurements for how fast we're going to respond and what we're going to do and how we're going to recover from it. And that organizations have to learn how to treat that whole process from beginning to end as part of the cybersecurity problem, not just the protect part, which is the part that's easy to get focused on. And in fact, I would actually argue that one of the things that we've been working very hard on in the federal context is actually those back-end pieces, the response and recovery part of starting to build the machinery inside the federal government to not just do the protection mission, but also the response and recovery mission.
I guess there's also been a lot of talk recently from Mike Rogers, the congressman, in fact, about developing offensive measures in cybersecurity, because a lot about what we're talking about are defensive operations, actually going, preparing ourselves to sort of go out and confront these issues where they arise. Any thoughts on that aspect of this?
So there are a couple of different aspects to that issue. One of which is that I think that there are many different tools that you have to think about in that context. One of which is, and so there are a couple of different ways I think about it. One of which is it's very rare that a cyber issue is purely going to necessitate a cyber response. In fact, actually, the proper response might be a diplomatic response. It might well be a law enforcement response. It might be one that occurs in cyberspace, but it might be one that we do primarily through network defense. It might be one that we do primarily through law enforcement authorities. It is nevertheless true that cyber and cyber operations are going to become a much greater part of statecraft. They have become that over the last 20 years, and that trend is going to continue. And so I think that as a government, one of our challenges is to begin to figure out how we talk about that policy development and how we talk about what the rules are for the road what the rules of the road we want to be in the international environment. We want to, I think, start talking about how we establish what the norms of behavior are in cyberspace. Things like that you don't target critical infrastructure in peacetime, that you don't harm, that you don't harm critical infrastructure in peacetime, that you don't steal intellectual property for the benefit of your domestic companies, that you don't maybe that you treat certs like hospitals, that they're off limits, so that they can continue to do their network functions. So those are the kind of norms that we want to promote in that space. So I think that it's another area that's going to involve a lot of policy work and development.
Well, clearly we could spend the whole day just talking about that. I think we have time for one more question if there's something else. Yep.
Andrew Boreen, I'm an attorney at Steptoe & Johnson here in town and also affiliated with Truman National Security Project's Defense Council. My question is, Truman did a lot of work looking at the prospects for passage of cyber legislation. And I think on the macro level, it appears that the president has stepped forward, done things like create your position, passed a couple executive orders, pushed for the NIST framework. But it seems like there's a limit how far the government can go in implementing the needed reform for the private sector without, some sort of carrot to pull them in or stick to drive them. So I'm just wondering, looking at things like Langevin bill or CISPA, what do you think the prospects are in the coming Congress for passage of comprehensive cyber legislation, and what are the ramifications if it doesn't pass?
So I've been in Washington a while now, and I've learned that there are a few things that you don't bet on. One is the weather, and the other is Congress. I think it's very difficult to project on that score. I know that there are a lot of people up on the Hill, like Representative Langevin, like Representative Chairman McCall on the House side. On the Senate side, you have a number of Senator Whitehouse and Senator Carper and others that have been incredibly involved in the cyber issues. And so there is Senator Rockefeller on the Commerce Committee. So there's a lot of interest in cybersecurity legislation. I do think that from the administration standpoint, one thing that has evolved in our thinking is that I do think that it would probably be easier for us to get smaller pieces of cyber legislation rather than one giant comprehensive bill. And so a lot of our efforts are involved at getting whatever we can passed in whatever on whatever vehicle we can manage to get it attached to, as long as the policy and the legislation itself is acceptable. So I think that's one thing that I would say that we're trying as a different way to go about it. I do think that we will continue to press forward with doing everything we can, and there's a lot that we can do under existing authorities. We do need to eventually get to legislation, and we will eventually have to get there, but I think that we will eventually. And we will continue pressing forward with what policies we can under the authorities we have.
Great. Well, thanks very much for coming and taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yep,
Bear with us for a couple minutes, maybe 1 minute. We're going to get mic'd up here. Well, thank you very much. And now we're actually at the best part of the day. So I'm glad all of you stayed here. Once again, I'm Scott Bates, president here at the Center for National Policy, and welcome to the home of CNP and the Truman Project. We have a great panel today. We've heard the view from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but we also wanted to provide you with a take from the private sector and from some of the leading thinkers in cybersecurity and cyberspace that this nation has to offer. How do we handle the emerging threats that we see in cyberspace? Can we increase our economic competitiveness, our national security, while keeping privacy protections and being innovative leaders? Is that possible to do? And if so, what are the trade-offs that inevitably must take place? These are tough questions, but fortunately we have with us three people that are well qualified to take them on. I've known our first guest for over a decade. How about that, Frank? Frank Cilluffo was present at the creation of the Homeland Security architecture of this nation that arose in response to the attacks of September 11th. During that time, Frank was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve in the newly created Office of Homeland Security. He served as the principal advisor for the first Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, and directed the President's Homeland Security Advisory Council. After some years in government, Frank joined George Washington University, where he established the Homeland Security Policy Institute. And Frank is an associate vice president at GW, where he leads a number of national security and cybersecurity policy and research initiatives. He's co-director of GW's Cyber Center for National and Economic Security and directs a university-wide strategic effort along with Michael Chertoff, the former DHS secretary. And thank you for being with us today, Frank. Peter Singer, to my right, is an author of multiple award-winning books. I have a few of them in my office, so feel free to come by and take a look. I think a few of you may have read his work before. He is really a leading expert on what we would call 21st century national security challenges. The Smithsonian Institution, Peter is a humble guy, but I had to do research to find out about this. The Smithsonian lists him as one of the 100 leading innovators in the nation. He is listed by Defense News as one of the 100 leading thinkers in defense policy, and by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 global thinkers who are most advanced on all of these issues as well. His most recent book is Cyber Security and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know. Are you able to say the title of your next book yet or not? This is a good one.
No, we'll wait for that.
Okay, stay tuned for that one. And his last book was named to the reading list for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy as well, so his thinking is very present in the armed forces today. Peter's a contributing editor at Popular Science and founder of Neo-Luddite, a technology advisory firm. He's a consultant to the U.S. military, DIA, and FBI as well. For many years, he was at Brookings and is now at the New America Foundation. Thank you for being with us, Peter. We appreciate it. And to my right is my new friend, Jeff Moss. Glad you could make it, Jeff. He is one of the most sought-after voices in information security around. He spent the last 17 years as founder and director of Black Hat and DEF CON, two of the most important security conferences in the world. Jeff has the rare ability to bridge the gap between the underground researcher community and law enforcement, which is not easy to do. And he also bridges the gap between pure research and responsible application in information systems. Jeff was appointed to the Homeland Security Advisory Council. He was at ICANN for many years as Chief Security Officer. He's been a keynote speaker all over the world on these topics. And prior to Black Hat, Jeff was also director at Secure Computing Corporation, where he helped establish professional services department there. So thanks for being with us very much. And the way we'll do this is I'll ask a couple questions. We were just in my office. I wish we had a hidden camera there because it was a fantastic conversation, not to put the pressure on. But we'll let them rip. You can interrupt each other or whatever you want to say. And then we'll go to you, the audience, for your thoughts and your questions. So we'll look forward to that. And I think first thing I would say is I was watching a movie last night, and it was from 1996. And the lead character had to keep stopping at payphones Think about that, right? And think about how the world has changed. And it seems hackneyed, but this is a unique moment in human history where we are able to access the information, the power of that information, individuals empowered to a degree that they never have been ever. And what does this mean for national power? So it would follow to me that the nation that is best able to use these technologies and adapt to them to its society is going to have the edge in securing its national security and its prosperity. So I suppose my broad question is, how are we doing on that? And where are our biggest failings? And in particular about the workforce. Where are we right now in preparing through education and training American workers and also those who need to serve in government to understand information networks and cyber? And I'll throw that jump ball. Frank, if you could focus a bit on government's needs, sure. And Peter, generally on society right now, where we are, and then Jeff, you'll get to interrupt. You're the disruptor. All right.
I'll interrupt already.
See
your example with the payphone. Yeah. Nowadays, there's no anonymity like you had with the payphone. At least that guy couldn't be tracked by the...
I try to tell my 8-year-old son about prank calls and what a loss it's been to society that we've lost anonymity. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Although the first hackers were phone freakers for the most part. So they
the biggest
were,
network to
hacking
explore.
On telephones. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Scott. And it's a privilege to join you here today. And thanks for your leadership on all of these issues. And you, too, were there at the get-go of a lot of our national security establishment after 9/11. Very briefly, in terms of the workforce needs, gaps, deficits, and also looking forward, I mean, obviously, it's a STEM issue at its very root. We do need more computer scientists, electronic engineers. We need more technical skills that can address some of these problems, including design and engineering, where we can start baking security into the design of systems, components, parts, and the like. I actually see my friend Mike Pepe here, who's doing some good work at Northrup Grumman, and stay tuned. We too have a paper coming out on some of those issues. But in addition to the technical needs, which I think everyone more or less recognizes and understands, there's also the need to get cyber into every other discipline. So we need to look at it from across multi- and interdisciplinary perspective. In addition to having the cyber needs, there's a cyber component to international affairs. There's a cyber component to law. There's a cyber component to public health, where you have, obviously, health and IT, which brings about new vulnerabilities and susceptible systems. So one of the things we're trying to do at a university is how do you integrate all of these pieces? How do you get diplomats who are cyber savvy but have the technical skills? I call it talk and squawk, meet beep and squeak. You've got one community that understands policy. You've got another community that understands technology. What you haven't seen fully is that integration just yet. And I think that's the greatest deficit in terms of workforce needs going forward. More STEM, women in particular. I'd like to see more women involved in STEM research, which can get to cybersecurity jobs, not as a footnote. I might note that I think the Navy does this best, where all midshipmen are required to take a cybersecurity course. I think we can all our services can learn from that, and universities can learn from that. So it's not an either-or, because if you think about cyber strategically at your meta level, it is its own domain, but it also touches every other domain, whether it's air, land, sea, space. So we need to start thinking from an education perspective the same way. It is its own domain. We need cybersecurity experts, but we also need others. Boards of directors, they need to start asking. I just had an op-ed with Tim Pawlenty, who heads the Financial Services Roundtable this week, on what questions should board members be asking management to fulfill their oversight responsibilities. So it's a C-suite issue, and it's a workforce issue. In the government, I think it's not so much a recruitment problem as it is a retention issue. I mean, if you really want to play with the coolest stuff, you go to NSA.
So is it that the personalities that are drawn to this kind of work don't fit into the bureaucratic structures of government, or is that too simplistic to?
That's part of it, because promotion paths are still kind of fuzzy because we don't have a clear discipline.
But I think the bigger part of it is once they get good, they can get 2.5 times their salary in the private sector.
Right. Thanks very much. You seemed like you wanted to say something there, Jeff.
Oh, nothing.
All right. Peter?
We do need more hackers.
Yeah.
That's right.
I was going just until that moment. I was going to say the problem with this panel is we're going to agree a lot, but maybe we'll see in a second.
Yeah.
This topic is too often framed as a technology issue, and we forget that it's a human issue. It's a human issue whether you're trying to understand the threat that's coming after you. It's a human issue if you're trying to understand your responses to the threat. And it's definitely now a human capital issue. And you can think of it as a human capital issue in a number of ways. Maybe to kind of frame what Frank was saying, there's both the cyber workforce issue and then there's the broader aspect of it. So the cyber workforce issue, I think, is best illustrated by the fact that, in 2008, Department of Homeland Security had roughly 40 people working full-time on cybersecurity issues. That number has been multiplied by over 50 since then. And of course, they're not stopping. We're not saying, oh, well, we really met the need. And take what happened at DHS and repeat it at pretty much every single government agency, whether it's the Pentagon to Health and Human Services to LA city government to New York state level government, to take that and add it on the private sector side. That same kind of gap is played out at both large technology companies to car makers to small furniture companies. And you quickly see we have a classic supply and demand issue playing out when it comes to cyber talent. Now, the key here, though, is I want to and how do we meet the talent gap? We throw money at it. So it's a good time to be someone with the skills. It's a bad time to be competing over it. That's really the story of retention on the U.S. side. It's going to be a really interesting retention problem for the U.S. military because at the same time that you're forcing out Captain so-and-so, who was the best company commander in Afghanistan we've ever seen, you're going to be doing bonuses for the egghead who's really good at cyber. And that's going to create a really interesting debate within the military. But I want to hit the other part that Frank said in terms of the broader training issue. Across every single field, you'll be dealing with cyber issues, and yet there's that equal training gap. So 70% of business executives have made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, despite the fact that no major MBA program teaches it as part of your normal management responsibilities. That's now.
We've got a cyber MBA.
Yeah, but, no, there is a cyber MBA.
Cyber.
No, let me be clear. There's a cyber MBA. I'm talking about the person who goes into human resources, the person who goes into operations, the person that goes into legal, the person that becomes the board member, not in cyber. And that's the same thing that plays out in how we train our lawyers, our journalists who are dealing with cyber issues, both on the cyber beat, but oh, by the way, on all the other beats. If you're a sports reporter in Houston, one of the sports teams there got hacked, and you had to cover that story. So the point is we've got this human capital gap, and don't just think about it as training the eggheads and the STEM folks. It's for all of us. And I would add this part hits the need to teach our kids basic cyber hygiene.
Jeff?
Well, that's a lot to follow up on. One thing I would say is I want to declare victory, hopefully in 10 years, and we stop sticking cyber in front of everything.
Yeah.
Because really, we need to get to that point where it's baked in. It's risk management, essentially. Cyber is just risk management. And when you tell board members that, they go, oh, okay, it's risk management. What are my risk reward trade-offs? And a lot of times we treat it like voodoo, like some magic thing.
That only the guy in the back can understand.
Right, only the guy in the back. And
there was the Washington, sorry to interrupt, there was that Washington Post op-ed a couple of days ago that said, why can't the wizards solve this for us? And you're like,
right. Well, my magic wand is being repaired right now at Hogwarts. But the other thing is, the problem I think is on the core root of a lot of it, none of it is, I hate to say it, none of it to me seems like a lot of rocket science. Mm-hmm. There's bad code that's being written that's being exploited. Okay, let's go to the root cause of that. How do we get better code written? Right? You can never fix all the problems, but let's fix the easy ones we can. And you start looking into it, and there's no good textbooks. to teach people how to program securely. There's plenty of textbooks to teach you how to program. They're full of programming errors that introduce security bugs. So from the very beginning, from junior high, high school, college, all the example everybody's learning how to use, full of security problems. That's just at a fundamental level. So you're starting off on the wrong foot. You go to Google and you want to learn how to write an algorithm, a fast sort algorithm or whatever, fast sort algorithm. The examples that pop up are full of security problems. So the search engines are full of bad code. The textbooks are full of bad code. How about somebody get publishing textbooks with a good example? I mean, there's steps we can take. Yet instead we'll pontificate about super advanced, fast-moving, invisible insider detection algorithms. And you're like, let's cover the bases. Let's teach people how to program before we're going to get to the moon. And so it gets a little frustrating.
Could I pick up on that point because I mean there is what is the role of the government, what is the role of the private sector, what is the role of the individual? Obviously it's a shared responsibility. We need cyber hygiene. Washing your hands saves more lives in surgery than actual surgery in some countries. But obviously that's not going to help with the real surgery. So what we need is sort of a tiered kind of approach. So let's get to the baseline. In an ideal world, we want to get to that 80% solution where government can then focus its limited resources on the high-end threat actor. The government should be focusing on, because what's new about cyber is companies, even the biggest of companies, didn't expect they're in the business of defending against foreign intelligence services.
Well, the government's never going to save you there, though.
Nor should they.
Yeah.
But they should be able to focus on the high-end threat actor and anything below that, so they're not getting involved in things that, quite honestly, the private sector is better positioned socially, from a privacy standpoint, and technically to be able to address. And then if you get the citizenry, the equivalent of cyber hygiene, you can get to a point where we can actually prioritize limited resources and actually deal with different threat
that's
actors.
lowering the noise threshold,
Absolutely.
right? Let's wash out the noisy people so we can focus on the high value.
The high-end threat, or where they're best positioned.
So you're mentioning threat, and let's go there for a moment before we throw it out to the audience for questions. Let's say you're advising the president. We just had a person that is advising the president, but we were busy talking out there, and we didn't hear what he had to say. So we'll see that on C-SPAN later. What is the largest threat in the cyber domain or for American prosperity and security, knowing that you have limited resources to handle these threats, not talking opportunities? Is it the theft of intellectual property, or is it some kind of malicious attacks from undeterrable state actors, non-state actors? Where should we be putting our resources right now?
You want to start, or
Peter?
I'll kick it off because I think I've been a little bit outspoken on this. I think that there is far too much discussion and focus on the sexiest narrative of cyber terrorism.
Pearl Harbor.
Yep. Cyber 9/11, Cyber Pearl Harbor are terms that have been used over 500,000 times in government documents and then repeated back in the media.
And we got to stop. We got to quit attacking Pearl Harbor, right? I mean, we're
cyber
alive.
Terrorism. There have been over 31,000 magazine, newspaper, and academic journal articles on the phenomena of cyber terrorism. There have been 0 actual incidents of cyber terrorism according to the FBI definition of it. Now, let me be fundamentally clear before it's misinterpreted. I am not saying there is not a risk of it. We've shown via our own weaponry, Stuxnet, that you can do damaging things with digital attack. We also know that there is a potential here. But there's a difference between putting out warnings of the cyber caliphate and yet adding in the fine print that says they don't have any capability nor proven interest in it.
Coming soon.
Yeah, but the point is, what I'm getting is, compared to that is a real threat. But you mentioned the other, which I don't think we do enough on, which is something that is definitively real and arguably bigger, which is the massive campaign of intellectual property theft that arguably we are the victims right now of the largest theft in all of human history. When you bundle together everything from Joint Strike Fighter design, the most expensive weapons project in human history, to oil company negotiating strategy, to small furniture makers, to pretty much every think tank and university in town. And that has both definite economic security consequences, and economic security is national security, but also, I would argue, it might have real consequence on a future battlefield 10 to 20 years from now. So the point is, I don't think we do enough on that compared to the easier discourse on Cyber 9/11.
So let me just interject for a second, because, Frank, I'm hearing shades of what we faced after 9/11 when we started up the Homeland architecture, which was, it was all guards, gates, and guns, and would take out a yellow pad and list every potential threat. There wasn't a lot of risk analysis there, which you were pointing to. Now, and so we're saying that we need to apply that more rigorously in the cyber domain.
Which, of course, I fundamentally agree with. It is an issue of risk management. It is an issue of secure coding, that and other things. Let me take I agree with much of what Peter said, but let me do a little shade of difference, too. Not all hacks are the same, not all hackers are the same, not all intentions are the same, and not all capabilities are the same. Computer network exploit, the theft of intellectual property, the theft of data, the theft of individuals' information. C&E is obviously at the top of the list. Anyone who's got an attack capability has to have an exploit capability. If they can exploit and they have the intent to do so, they can also attack. So I think you have to start getting to a point where you can start peeling back what that threat is. So at the very top of the list are peer nations with the United States, Russia, China. They have capabilities. They're investing in those capabilities. They're engaged in computer network exploit. They're also increasingly, through proxies or independently, engaging in computer network attack. After the Russias and the Chinas of the world, you've got countries that are, what they lack in capability, they more than make up for in intent. This is Iran. This is North Korea. Given the size of their GNPs, they are investing very heavily in computer network attack capability. So don't underestimate that. I think that any form of future conflict will have a cyber component to it, either from a C4ISR, a collection standpoint, down to an attack perspective. So when you're looking at who's most likely to turn to an attack, probably Iran, North Korea, because they're less deterrable than, say, the Russias and the Chinas. Underneath that, you've got criminal enterprises, notably Eurasian, Russian-speaking criminal enterprises that now have the cyber capabilities that used to be in the domain of countries alone. So there they can do the equivalent of a cyber drive-by shooting that can have major economic consequence as well as kinetic consequence. Then underneath that, you've got foreign terrorist organizations. For the most part, they are in the business of propaganda. I mean, if you look at ISIS, their propaganda machine is incredibly sophisticated. But it's not kids with iPhones, as everyone thinks. Don't forget, they took over TV stations. They have the same production capabilities that major networks have globally. So they may turn to computer network attack, but they don't have that capability yet, I would argue. But they're increasingly building that out. And then you've got hacktivists. Whatever the flavor ideology is of the week, that's what you're going to see. So we got to get a little more clear and concise when we start talking about what that threat is. But I don't disagree that coming soon it tends to be the issue. But I think we also want a mirror image. We know what our own capabilities are and expect that it's not 5 years out in terms of R&D. It's not like nuclear capabilities that takes millions, billions of dollars in research and development to build out the capability. So,
Jeff, your thought. Thank you, Frank.
So I'll just say I agree. It's intellectual property theft. That's got the big dollar tag, right? So I'm not going to, me too, +1, thumbs up, whatever it is, like. But I'll also say, for me, from more of a non-military, non-governmental perspective, it's really, we've entered this realm where small to medium businesses are really defenseless. You're just screwed. Because if you look at the economics of the situation, security is also just basic economics. If you've got skills, you want to get a better paying job. Who's paying better? Google, Microsoft, Apple, whatever. And they're trying to protect their intellectual property. So the best talent just feeds uphill to the biggest companies. And that really leaves us small to medium businesses with kind of the middle team, the B team, the C team. As soon as the C team can get hired as a B team, or they're out of there. So we're in a situation where the companies in the middle are essentially defenseless. right? They're buying store-bought solutions because they don't have custom integration. They're buying whatever the last guy in that job said to buy. And we're also moving into a situation where I really worry a lot about denial of service attacks, just because they're well understood. There have been best practices around how to defend against denial of service attacks for 20 years, and we don't do them. Right? The government doesn't mandate it. The ISPs don't mandate it. Very few do. Comcast does now. But there's very few. So I hear all these stories about these great new technologies we're going to deploy or the next internet, and I'm thinking to myself, we can't deploy well-understood, low-cost denial of service denial of service prevention for 20 years. What makes us think that we're going to go and solve this next generation, and take this challenge head on? We can't even cover our bases. And so that's led me to this. If you look at our trajectory, it's complexity from here all the way down. And complexity is only going to accelerate with the Internet of Things, all these other technologies. So we're never going to pause. We're never going to take our breath. We're never going to go back and fix things. We just seem to run faster and faster, leaving this trail of vulnerability behind us. And I don't like predicting doom and gloom, but you always sit around, you have a beer, and you say, well, when is this going to end? Oh, it's going to take a big cyber event, and then we can fix everything. Right. It's like, I don't think it's going to work that way. I don't think we all have plans on the shelf, and the minute something gets cyberized, we pull our plans off and get funding. Right? So I think it's really it's up to us to protect it, but we also have to realize that we're really overreaching, I believe, thinking that we're going to solve all these complicated problems, when it's a lot of really basic stuff that we can't even block and tackle. So I love having the complicated discussions. It's really exciting. But at the end of the day, I always go back to, if you can't even defend against denial of service attacks, like the Iranians attacking Wall Street, that's Wall Street. They've got a lot of money. And even they are having problems defending against, right? You see the capacity that some organized crime groups have. It's pretty frightening. And my fear is, my doomsday scenario in this area is, a couple small to medium businesses get bumped off the net by a denial of service attack. They get put out of business because they can't respond. Enough small to medium businesses that go out of business because of this, what government's going to let their SMEs go out of business? No, the government's going to act. And they're going to do something to save the day. And now they're in there regulating. Because the industry hasn't handled it, because the technology providers haven't handled it. We've only had 20 years. So at some point, the government's going to say, enough is enough. I can't have my company is going out of business. Mm-hmm. And now that's going to be, I think, the forcing function where they're going to say, well, you've had your chance. And that's a frightening scenario to be in.
Thank you, Jeff.
Within this doom and gloom, there is some positive news that's playing out from, frankly, the bad things that have happened in the last year. And you mentioned it in the article that you're working on. So the Target breach was bad for Target in many, many ways, billion-dollar bad. But because there was punishment in terms of the marketplace, punishment in terms of people losing jobs, punishment in terms of the board being threatened with a recall, it sent shockwaves throughout numbers of other boards, and it's bringing attention to this, and we're seeing action happen in a way that wasn't before. And so what I'm getting at is that there is, in this aura of cyber insecurity that surrounds us right now, we're seeing a lot of the needed actions that have been put off for a long time moving forward. We're seeing the building up of kind of the awareness that we've called for. We're seeing the change in some of the education. Now, clearly, it's not fast enough. It's not good enough. But we're in a better place than we were, say, 2-3 years ago. And part of it, again, I hope we can change from the mentality from thinking that we have to defend against everything to instead become resilient, power our way through it. The way I kind of joke about it is squirrels have taken down more power grids than hackers have. You had the Wall Street scenario. Squirrels have taken down Wall Street trading 3 times. Hackers have done it 0 times. You'll never defeat or deter squirrels, but we figured out how to be resilient against Rocky and Bullwinkle. Mm-hmm. We'll never defeat or deter all cyber threats, but we can become more resilient against them.
Thank you. A sustainable war on squirrels. We can do that.
And groundhogs.
Oh, that's right. Well, I promised that we would engage the audience in questions, and so please, anybody that has a thought or a question that you'd like to share. Yes, in the back. That's you, Dan Hartnett. That's right.
All right. Dan Hartnett, I'm a China analyst at Center for Naval Analyses, and also a defense council member here at Truman. Question brought up actually in the earlier panel, or topic brought up in the earlier panel, was the idea of international norms, establish them so that we don't do IPR theft, for example. Is there a way to really, in your personal opinions, get China to the table to talk truly constructively about this type of issue, when in reality it kind of supports their main drive, the Communist Party, which is economic development? How do you go about doing that without using, I guess, more coercive means, such as economic sanctions, for example, against companies that do engage in this? Because obviously naming and shaming, PLA units to do the hacking is not really working for the most part. Thank you.
I'll take a first bite at that. I mean, that's a great question. And the way to think about it, I think, is we talk deterrence and the various threats. You deter actors. You don't deter things. You don't deter cyber. You can build up capabilities to make yourself more resilient, bake in more secure design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're really looking at intellectual property theft, and when you're looking at the role that China is playing right now, they kind of have it the best of both ways. They have all the luxuries of being an emerging economy, and they've got none of the responsibilities of being a power. Well, the reality is they are a power. The reality is it's very mercantilist. From their view, why spend billions in dollars in R&D if you can steal it and put that money into market share? The flip side is they've got an overheating economy, so I'm not sure it's very easy for them to stop or to be able to address in a full, transparent kind of way. I am somewhat more optimistic, though, that at some point they've got as much to lose because they've got investments spread out, including in the United States, including in our debt. So at some point it hits that tipping point. I don't think it's hit that tipping point just yet. I do think naming and shaming is significant. The fact that the Mandiant report could get down to individuals, I think, was significant. This is not smokescreen discussion. They were able to show specifically who's behind that clickety-clack of the keyboard doing what. I think the Department of Justice indictments was also a powerful statement. That said, that's not going to be the end state solution. So once you start looking at how you bake cybersecurity into trade discussions, you're starting to see, let's stop admiring the problem, I think we're all saying here. Let's go from the nouns to the verbs. And I think the real verbs, the real place you can have greatest traction is going to be more through economic levers and discussion.
And I would build on that. It's classic cost benefit, and right now they are seeing extreme benefit and almost no cost. And that Mandiant report was powerful, except that unit, I think it was roughly 90 days until then they started up again. So you got kind of 90 days of rest. Part of how to get to this is not only making it harder on the attacker. It shouldn't be just picking ripe fruit. And we've talked a little bit about that. But the other aspect is, to build on what Frank was saying, take it to venues that they actually care about. So a Pennsylvania courtroom is a wonderful place for a lot of reasons, but it's not going to be visited by those 5 Chinese individuals who were indicted. And it was a warning shot that may have been a powerful statement, but it actually had no impact except on some of the American businesses that then lost business because of it. I would argue a better venue is figure out venues that they care about and not merely bilateral trade talks, but more specifically the WTO, which has been crucial to their economic rise, and it offers you a setting to play on these issues that they would start to pay a little bit more attention to. But again, the key in this is don't think of this as just purely a space for talk. We've got to move to action where it's viewed in kind of classic cost-benefit analysis. And the other part of it is, frankly, recognize that some of it is never going to stop. This is the games that nations play. My British friends find it very funny that we talk about intellectual property theft, given that our economic rise was based on some intellectual property theft of what Britain was doing in the early industrial age and steam engines. To during the Cold War, we were able to come to tacit agreements with the KGB. Neither side liked the other stealing information, but we were able to set kind of the Moscow rules, so to speak, between this is the kind of info theft you can do, but these are the kind of actions that move us into more potential conflict. So this behavior, we don't like it, but it's acceptable, versus this behavior is the kind that could cause a shooting war. So to give an example, it may greatly disturb me that you're stealing from a defense contractor. I don't like it. I'm going to do everything possible to stop it. On the other hand, when you start monkeying around in nuclear command and control networks or power grids, wow, you're doing something that's raising a different kind of alarm for me.
Thanks.
Great.
Jeff?
Yeah, I would have to go for the civil society side of this, which is I think we should just sue everybody. That's because if you look in these discussions, what's missing is a lot of civil society lawsuits, right? How many American companies is Google suing anybody in China over this? No, well, they're probably going to lose. But if you don't try, you don't set case precedent. And what it would act as is a forcing function in China or other countries to get them to have to actually have their court system respond. And then the whole world could watch their court system play monkey games with it. And then the whole world could say, wow, China's not terribly transparent, or whichever country it is. And if you look at who's doing that, it comes down to basically Microsoft and sometimes Facebook. So Microsoft is pursuing botnet organizers and trying to sue them. And why is it just Microsoft, right? Why is there not a huge association of people? I can donate money to Doctors Without Borders. I can donate money to save cats. Where do I donate my $10 to go sue criminals and cyber thieves? Right? There's no outlet for me as a civil society person to say, go get them. So instead, all of our conversations orbit around what can government do for me? And it's like, no, I want civil society to go sue people left and right.
I think we've just created a new nonprofit.
Yeah. I mean, I've got lawyers that have lined up saying, as soon as you start that, I want to be your person in Europe.
All right.
But I find the conversation kind of always very two-dimensional.
Thank you.
I gotta disagree a little bit.
Go for
it. Because we don't want cybersecurity to become a cigarette wrapped in asbestos where the trial lawyers define what the requirements and needs are.
We want the government to do that.
No, I actually want a free market driven. So I'm not suggesting.
It's not
working. You're right, and we got to get to the point because I think Peter brought it up at the very end, which is there's a difference between life safety systems and critical infrastructure, where even what would be defined as less than root cause or super access or whatever terminology you want to use is a serious set of issues that should ring bells. But what I think you want to be able to get to is where does the market fall short from there? How do you bridge that gap between where we are to where we need to be? And that's where you've got the mix of carrots and sticks. What I'm worried about when you have the legal press, it becomes a precedent. Then it becomes a check the box, and then I said, oh, I did it, and I can go back to business as usual.
But if you want to talk about what's a cyber norm, well, the cyber norms debate is all happening at governmental level because there's no civil society norms because they're not engaging.
So let's, thank you. Let's go for another question from the audience. Yes, please, with the lanyard there.
Just that notion that things are getting better as far as corporations improving cybersecurity. I'm wondering if there's one way to incentivize that moving faster because, yes, Target took some sales hits, but they weren't that sustained, and some boardrooms might have gotten nervous, but obviously Home Depots didn't get nervous enough to take action. So how do you improve that process? Because some of the worst-case scenarios that people were talking about 3 and 4 years ago are happening now.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it's not the solution, but I was a criminal justice major. And criminal justice majors, we love data. And so you can actually try to make an informed policy decision. And there's not good data on any of this. There's, 48 different breach notification laws in this country. Every state's got something different. If you're, Target, you're going to spend the next 9 months figuring out who you have to disclose what to and when, as opposed to taking that energy or resources and fixing the problem. So I'm a big advocate of a national breach notification law. Not because it's going to be perfect. It's going to have all kinds of problems and special interests in there. But at least we get uniform sets of data that we can now start collating and finding trends. And, we talk about, I was a big believer that the market was going to solve this problem. I can look at speeches from 15 years ago where I'm like, the market's going to save the day. And what it turns out is people buy product based on features. It's impossible to look at two pieces of software and say, this is more secure and that's less secure. Now, as a proxy, you can say this has got twice as many features. So I probably think it has twice as many bugs. But people don't buy on less features, they buy on more features. So the market didn't really failed us. So then we were thinking, well, the insurance company is going to come and save the day. Just like it forces us to build better automobiles to get lower rates, insurance companies are going to give a lower rate to whoever, Microsoft or something. Well, that doesn't happen because you can't build actuarial tables because there's no good data. So then the next thing is where we are now. The only thing left we've got is regulation. And that's a really scary, roll the dice kind of proposition. And I really wish the market did it. And I really wish insurance did it. And, we're running out of options.
Peter, any thoughts?
Sure. And this actually connects back to the last side. There has been some great things that the executive branch has done, but it can only go so far. It can't write and pass laws. And, we could have kind of an argument, but roughly we've not had major cybersecurity legislation since the iPhone came out, the iPhone 1. And that's a gap here. And so this hits to, I'm a fan of what played out with NIST and creating standards, and they did I would argue a very good job of reaching out to private industry, collaborative, but at the end of the day, standards are something that the best companies will surpass, the average company will meet, and the bad company or unable company will not meet. And I look at this room right now. There are these things that are kind of pink exit signs over all the doorways, and they are there not because the builder here was exceptionally nice. It was because at the end of the day, there was law here. And this is not just in terms of things like notification, but you mentioned in the question, you made the parallel between Target and goodness, Home Depot was recently hit. Well, there's a fascinating illustration of the power of the law, which is how you were affected by the Home Depot hit dependent on your nationality. So same company, same breach, your experience depended on whether you shopped at the Home Depot in Buffalo, New York versus the Home Depot in Toronto. Because in Canada, they've got chip and pin, and pretty much none of the Canadian customers were affected by it, whereas the American customers were affected by it. What I'm getting at here is kind of an agreement. There's only so much that the marketplace can do on its own. At some point, government, i.e. legislation, has to play a role. And it's been absent.
The biggest gap in legislation, there are multiple bills out there, is to facilitate the sharing of information. So you've got public-private, you got public-public to ensure that information can be shared across and between all our 9/11 issues redo. You've got public-private and you've got private-private. I actually lean a little more in the role of more active defense, where companies can take a little more proactive steps, not taking down servers in Beijing or wherever else it may be, but at least to be able to collect forensics information that can be shared. Right now, that is the big impediment. So once you get to the facilitation of information sharing, once you get to some of the liability exemption, only if they're doing what they need to be doing, they need to meet that bar. Because the NIST framework, I am a big supporter of, but it really is a plan to plan. Eisenhower said, in preparation for battle, I've often found plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. It is important, but it's not going to be the end state. But if you do get to that point, then you can have other levers that I think ultimately get us to the point we're getting at.
Well, we've got time for one last question. Does anybody have a question that can be answered in 2 minutes? You don't. That figures. It's a think tank audience. You're thoughtful people. I have one, which is, and this is maybe in a lightning round, 30-second response. Will
McLaughlin Group.
That's
Go.
right. Go. They don't even know what we're talking about.
No.
Yep. So here it is. In the lame duck session that's coming up, is there opportunity for some kind of cyber security legislation to go forward? What have you been hearing? Do you think that might actually happen? And failing that, how does it look next year?
I'll go first. 30 seconds. I'm just happy that finally the executive branch gave authority to DHS to actually scan other executive government facilities for vulnerabilities. I mean, if DHS is going to have authority for .gov and they can't even scan, and they're learning more about what's going on in the government from reading private sector researchers scanning the government, right? There's such a big disconnect on the authorities and capabilities. So I'm happy that we don't need legislation for that. Let's get DHS and some of these other federal agencies taking care of their own business, and they don't need external legislation necessarily for that. So I think we can still make lots of progress, like the continuous diagnostic monitoring, CDM. I'm a big fan of it because that's going to force a lot of changes down the road. So I think there's a lot of good things happening, but I don't think we have to sit back and say without legislation, at least in government. See, I'm putting back on my government hat.
There you go. Peter.
3 quick things. So one, because it's been delayed so long, it's become almost like a log jam.
Everybody wants to put everything in the legislation.
So you've got that problem. Second, you've got Snowden effect and how issues relating to that are connecting over, and that, I believe, unless that'll slow it down. And then third, more broadly, while I wish it was the other way, it's always a safe bet to bet against congressional action and energy.
Right. Fair point. Frank, you have the last word.
It's been said, a pessimist is an optimist with experience. I'm somewhat optimistic. I wouldn't hold my breath because we've all been around this rodeo a number of times, but at least you have bicamerally similar bills. So Feinstein, Chambliss, you've got Gillibrand with her bill to incent information sharing. They're not trying to boil the ocean and cover everything anymore. They do have discrete bills. On the House side, the Feinstein-Chambliss bill aligns with the Rogers-Rupersberger bill, CISPA or whatever it's renamed. And then you've got the House Homeland Committee bill, which also is not a separate bill altogether. So you have staff and members actually working across jurisdictions. That rarely happens in Congress. So, I mean, I always say there are 3 parties, Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators. The reality is now you are starting to see them work across chambers and across parties. So would I bet on it? Absolutely not, but I'm not a gambler. But at least there is some momentum.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'd like to thank all of you for attending this conference today, talking about one of the most challenging policy areas facing our nation, central to our security and prosperity in the 21st century. And I'm optimistic after hearing what I've heard today that we're moving in the right direction. I'd like to also thank our partner, Christian Science Monitor, and Northrop Grumman for making this possible. And please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.